And we are live
Hey, how's it
and
going?
in person. Here we go. It's a Decline and
I
Fall
can't
live
hear
show.
you. Hang on.
Okay.
Hello?
Let me just check here. This is the virtues of live television, everybody, which is that you often find yourself in a situation where the technical problems reveal themselves. This is your behind the scenes moment. Uh,
Hello?
can you hear me now? Hello? Can you hear me now?
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Can't hear you.
Okay, hang on.
Oh,
Can you hear me now?
yes.
Excellent. Right. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. That was a glimpse behind the curtain. You are not going to get that on the BBC. It is a testament to the raw honesty of this broadcast that we are bringing to you the technical faults, because you know what? We have enough confidence in the news product we are about to deliver to you that the any rough around the edges part of the wonders of the internet production problems that come with this kind of show, you, the good audience, will forgive us for that. Because unlike Newsnight, we're not going to pause any particular interview or discussion to read out a text message from Nigel Farage. And unlike Newsnight, of course, we didn't employ Paul Mason. Paul, of course, will be featured on today's show. And Paul, if you're watching, and I know you do, we will be reviewing your book at some point soon. I'm looking forward to it because the last few times I've read collections of yours, and I am speaking directly to you now, Paul, it revealed to me that not only had you not read much Marx, but the bits of it that you had read, you hadn't understood. So I look forward to your history of communism, because basically it seems to be a history as written by a man who claims to be a Trotskyist but doesn't seem to have actually read any Trotsky, and whose knowledge of Marxism seems to have come exclusively from reading shortened Reader's Digest versions of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. So, Paul, you can sit tight and wait for our review. It is coming. But of course, we are here today to discuss various different shall we say, news events that have happened, including Andy Burnham's commitments to the Ukraine war, unsurprisingly, Andy Burnham's commitments to nuclear weapons, unsurprisingly, the appointment of a deranged militarist lunatic named John Healey as Chancellor of the Exchequer, which it really takes some going to beat the last few Chancellors of the Exchequer in terms of being a deranged militarist, but they've managed it again. And also the ongoing Saudi war on Yemen and the British role in that. But before we get to anything else, here, live and in person from the once and future socialist Yugoslavia, it's Kit Clarenberg. And Kit, are you looking forward to reviewing Paul's book?
Yeah, I'm positively dripping with excitement. I cannot wait, and we can see from the the groundswell of agitation for this book to come out. Whenever Paul, with his over 500,000 X or Twitter followers, promotes his book and the ever escalatingly high discounts you can get on it by pre-ordering, it generates like 1 or 2 likes, and I like to make fun and then mock him for that. And I mean, yes, we did start with a welter of technical faults. We're sorry about that, but in the spirit of symbolism, we are going to be talking about a number of people whose parents view them as, and indeed probably nickname them, technical faults. And this includes Paul Mason, Andy Burnham, and of course John Healey, who looks like he was turned down for the job of crap Professor Snape impersonator. So should we give them a kicking, Alex?
Let's go. So, John Healey, if you are indeed you are watching, I view you more as a sort of failed Nosferatu impersonator. You're here to suck the lifeblood out of what's left of the British nation. Now, this week has seen a certain Andrew Burnham commit himself, as has done the last several prime ministers, including Boris Johnson, the ill-fated Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, Sir Keir Starmer, and now Burnham. That's 5 in 5 years, everybody, have launched themselves off to Kiev to commit themselves to, well, they say Ukraine, I say the continuation of the Ukraine war. Now, what this means is that they have gone off, done the man hug with Zelensky, and committed that is Burnham's government to continuing the war on Russia using the dragooned, whipped and beaten and press ganged men of Ukraine, including, of course, men who now are currently resident in European countries, who there is increasing talk of packing them up, deporting them off, and forcing them off to the front line. Well, good luck with that, because I really can't see many of them hanging around to find out if they will be wake up chained to a drone in Donbass. But what this means basically is essentially that there is, of course, no change in British government policy, because British government policy is not about elections. It is not about changes of prime minister. It is not about whether it is Boris Johnson saying, big revival of Britain, or Andy Burnham saying, what we believe in is Manchesterism, whatever the fuck that is. It's about the priorities of the British ruling class. And the priorities of the British ruling class at the moment are defending the British position in West Asia. That's one priority, which we'll come to later. And also delivering and inflicting a defeat upon the Russians that is severe enough to destabilize the Putin system, or the Putin organized system, and stand a chance of reimposing a Yeltsin type figure in Russia, or breaking up the country entirely. I think breaking up the country entirely would be the preference of a certain Chris Donnelly, of whom more later. Now, this is so it doesn't matter whether it's Boris or Truss or Sunak or Starmer or Burnham. This is a strategic priority for the British ruling class, and it's an obsession of the military clique that runs much of Britain's defence and security infrastructure. And so, no prime minister who aspires to govern in a, shall we say, in an establishment fashion is going to disagree with this, is going to deviate from it, even if that means hurling hundreds of billions into the void, which will largely be stolen by the Ukrainian oligarchy, even if it means condemning millions of Ukrainians to death, doesn't matter. The Brits will continue to do this. And even if it means ultimately destabilizing his own government by trying to push through a commitment to spend 3 to 3.5% of GDP on defense by 2030 or 2035, depending upon which timeline you believe, even if that it means that essentially that his government doesn't last 5 minutes, Burnham's going to do it, because he's not exactly the kind of man who's going to defy the expectations of the British ruling class and the rabid imperialist clique that runs the Labour Party and has run the Labour Party since its inception, arguably. So, Kit, in news that is entirely unsurprising, how unsurprised were you by all of this?
Well, I mean, yes, entirely unsurprised, and I think that we have before Starmer even became prime minister, we were discussing the kind of trajectory that he would enjoy, quote unquote, in office, which is to say, he would come in all guns blazing, make all sorts of commitments and loud noises about preparing for war with Russia, and then do absolutely nothing, because there's actually very little that he could do. And we've been vindicated on that, as we've been vindicated on so many other things. But I increasingly see Starmer's resignation as, yes, a very much stage managed military coup of sorts, because yes, Starmer's role was to get Britain into war with Russia, or at least in some form of direct confrontation, called anything but a direct war. And of course, as we discussed in episodes passing, Starmer and Healey, they were very prominently featured together, frequently wearing military fatigues to really drive home that they're hard bastards who can stand up for Britain, etc., against the evil Russians. Obviously that didn't come to pass, but it was what he was meant to do. And I think that his resignation, following on from John Healey's own, which was explicitly and avowedly inspired by the fact that Starmer was putting Britain at risk by refusing to spend more on defence and forcing cuts on the military. That the foundations were being laid for Starmer's successor, which was pretty much always going to be Andy Burnham, to try and achieve the same objective and do it with maybe a tiny bit more media savvy and charm than Starmer, which is not difficult, although the overall objective is extremely difficult for reasons that we've gone into. We did a dedicated special called Death by Stock Buyback, which I would urge people to check out, which is about British military commissioning and the corruption and the inefficiency of it, and how, irrespective of how much money Britain pumps into quote unquote defense, it's not going to translate into weapons, it's not going to translate into military capability, and perhaps most crucially of all, it's not going to translate into having more soldiers. Now, Burnham, yes, he's within days of taking office with much hype because he has a Mancunian accent, it seems. He met with Zelensky. He
It's not a Mancunian accent. It's a Wirral accent. Oh. It's a Wirral accent.
But he likes to claim it's Mancunian.
It's not. It's a Wirral accent. He's from the Wirral. It's posh Scouse, basically. Sorry to interrupt.
Posh Scouse. That's a I think that quite a few people will be angry at that designation, but quite rightly, perhaps. But anyway. The point is that yes, that Burnham, his first meeting with a foreign state leader is with Zelensky, and he reiterates Britain's cast iron, unassailable, cemented support for Kiev as long as it takes. Now, that's kind of to be expected at this stage. But what actually really did frighten me, to a large degree, is the fact that John Healey was brought back in as Chancellor. Now, yes, as I mentioned, Healey explicitly resigned on the basis that Britain wasn't spending enough on war and wasn't doing enough to prepare to fight Russia by 2030. I'm not sure why they've picked that year, although it's a nice round-sounding number. Healey, as I revealed to the Grey Zone a few days back, he has been receiving advice since 2021, not only from Paul Mason, who, as we know, is a completely and utterly deranged, delusional, Russophobic, paranoid hawk of the absolute highest order, who has all sorts of insane ideas about everything, including horse sex. But Mason has served as a bridge between Healey and our old friend Chris Donnelly. Now, this privileged access that Donnelly enjoyed with Healey gave him the ability to send Healey all manner of briefings and talking points on issues like nuclear war. Shock horror, Donnelly's proposed talking points for the Labour Party, which he submitted at Healey's request, was don't approach this issue in an alarmist way. It's not really that much of a big deal. In the lead up to the outbreak of the Ukraine proxy war, Donnelly was feeding all sorts of deranged prescriptions to Healey, saying, well, if we give Ukraine long-range missiles and that provokes Russia, so be it. And we must ask ourselves the extent to which Donnelly played a personal role in helping the proxy war happen exactly when it did, because that's been his overriding objective, personally and professionally, for much of his life, but particularly since the Maidan coup. And he played a very central role in Ukraine's brutal so-called anti-terrorist organization in Donbass for 8 years. But the point is back in April 2022, and this is at a time when supposedly Ukraine and Russia were on the verge of signing a peace agreement, and Boris Johnson sabotaged it. Although, with hindsight, how realistic that peace deal was is certainly debatable. Donnelly was emailing Healey saying that we really need to get Britain on a wartime footing. Ukraine can defeat Russia. All we need, and we can prosecute this conflict successfully, all we need to do is get on a wartime footing and start spending on the military appropriately, but also make the military part of government decision making. So fast forward to today, and John Healey wants a military officer with him at the Treasury. And which is, I mean, very, very, very dubious for a variety of reasons. But this actually reflects a long-standing strand of British military thinking of inserting soldiers and generals into the running of government. This is an ongoing project which dates back at least 2 decades, and of which Chris Donnelly has been a very fervent advocate for a long time, to the extent that you would have the military chiefs making and influencing government policy. It is a very, very frightening development, and it's something that we should be concerned about, because this is a point that you and I have made many times, Alex, and it does bear repeating, is yes, it's a completely insane idea getting Britain into direct conflict with Russia. There is not the public will for it. There's not the public capability for it. There is not. Britain doesn't have the soldiers, the military equipment, the ability to create ammunition or shells or missiles at all, let alone at the pace and scale necessary to fight a kind of Donbass style conflict with anyone, least of all Russia. But they're still going to try and do this, and in the process a large number of people are going to be corralled into supporting this, or that's at least going to be the objective. Now, a few days back, a poll was published which showed that just 6% of Britons would defend their country if it was invaded. So, to say nothing of voluntarily signing up to get killed horrifically, probably by drones or some other mechanized death machine in a far-flung field in a country they know very little about and have probably never been to. That's not going to happen. So, I mean, conscription is in itself problematic, but it's the kind of thing they might try and do, even if via the back door. There's a lot of talk from Burnham about trying to get young people off benefits, these despicable young layabouts who have zero job opportunities. Let's start penalising them and withholding benefits from them, so they have to get jobs. Ooh, well, the army's hiring, so that's one means that they could try and achieve this insane objective. And it's been announced before even Burnham took office. It was announced that the British government is going to start a national roadshow to try and prepare the British public for war and encourage them to start rationing and adopt a wartime mindset. So this is all really, really, really worrying, and it's going to happen whether people like it or want it or not. So the time for a concerted pushback is now.
Well, yes, and just to say that this will no doubt end in a complete failure, and it'll end Burnham's government the same way it ended Keir Starmer's. I mean, one of the reasons why Keir Starmer was booted in the end was because he was so hideously and massively unpopular. The same thing will end up happening to Burnham, even though he's better at presenting things. This attempt to militarize British society, which they are trying to do, but ultimately it won't work, because there's a fundamental problem that they have, which is that their own degenerate system is incapable of being militarized. You can't militarize a completely financialized, hollowed out system. Like 50, 60 years ago, Britain still had the kind of industrial base that could equip an army. It doesn't have it anymore. People like John Healey and, the people doing the thinking for him, which seems to include Paul Mason, which is, terrifying to think of. They imagine that if they just keep saying things like reindustrialization for national security, and Burnham put something akin to this in his first speech before he became prime minister, which is increasing self-reliance in agriculture. Well, the reason why the Britain buys around about 50% of its food from South America, Southeast Asia, West Asia, etc., is because it's produced on the cheap by hyper exploitable workers, and therefore it's cheaper, and therefore that helps the British ruling class hold down wages in Britain because they get cheap agriculture in to sell to people. So therefore, hopefully, papering over the cracks that come from being a very low wage economy. Now, if you try and produce all that in Britain, it's going to be immeasurably more expensive, even if it's heavily automated. So how is that circle going to square itself? It's not. How are you going to reindustrialize when the profits on industrialization are so low and the private sector in Britain is so parasitic it won't invest? How are you going to deal with that? Paul Mason, having read some of his ravings in some of the position papers, seems to think that he can that you can just throw money into the void, or in some of Mason's more ambitious ravings, suddenly recreate the British planned economy from 1940 to 45 that did exist. But at that time, Britain was at the center of global trading and also had the ability to exploit the resources of around about a third of the world in terms of access to British colonies. And they could find a lot of the metals and minerals they needed for war material production in the colonies. They don't have that anymore. It's gone. So this attempt is going to be a dangerous failure. It's going to be a dangerous failure because you have in Britain, and we have covered this before, and it's not just people like Starmer, he's gone. It's not just people like Healey and Paul Mason and Chris Donnelly. There's a whole layer of people in the security and defense architecture in this country, in the top layers, who are crazy enough to believe that if they just declare it, then it will become so. And the other factor in this is that some of these people are half mad, but they're not entirely mad. They know very well that if Britain, France, Germany tried to go up against the Russians toe to toe, they'd all lose. They'd stand no chance of doing it whatsoever. The only chance would be to bring in on their side, of course, the United States, because none of the European countries, even if you put them all together, have the capability to lift large numbers of troops, have the capability to field a large enough navy to push, they think, the Russians out of the Black Sea or back in the Black Sea. None of them really have the manpower available to go up against the Russian armed forces, which are considerably larger. The only ones who do, conceivably, are the Americans, and they've got a lot of problems of their own. So this goes to the relationship between Britain and the United States, which is that going back all the way to old Rudyard Kipling, the poetic old racist, when he wrote White Man's Burden. Well, what was that about? That was about a declining Britain, which was already deindustrializing and becoming more parasitic, leaning on the military power of the United States to defend its assets overseas. Now you have a Britain which is immeasurably more degenerated, desperately trying to maneuver the bigger United States into some kind of war footing with the Russians. This seems to be the plan of some of these people. Now, Kit, you wrote an article recently about this relationship between Britain and the United States. I don't know if you wanted to comment any more on this story or whether you wanted to speak more about what the plans of the Chris Donnelly clique are to try and maneuver the United States with, of course, their collaborators within the United States government itself who believe in the same thing into this direct conflict with Russia.
Yeah, sure. So, my recent investigation from my website, which is titled "How Britain Exploits U.S. Empire," it did spring to mind as you were discussing this, Alex, because it was quite extraordinary to me to come across a set of leaks authored again by our dear friend Chris Donnelly, which he states in black and white points that we've been making for a very, very, very long time, even before we decided to launch Decline and Fall. And it sums up very, very usefully and concisely how Britain exploits and manipulates the US. This is not to suggest that the US is in any way innocent, let alone that Britain has a degree of control over what the US does. Far, far from it, actually. But what Britain can do is it can present itself as an expert on particular issues which are unfamiliar, or areas of the world which are unfamiliar to the US, and offer their expertise and services in helping the US exert or assert its hegemony in those areas or those regions or in those fields. And Donnelly very bluntly states that the relationship between the US and the UK is based on how much the US needs something from the UK to help the US develop and maintain its superpower status. And yeah, I mean, that's what Britain does. And there is, a highly self-perpetuating component here, where Britain was at the forefront of, as I mentioned, of stirring up trouble in eastern Ukraine at a time post Maidan, when the Obama administration was at least publicly committed to a doctrine of not militarily escalating or provoking Russia, and there was a strict ban in place on providing lethal aid to Ukraine. Of course, the country was drowning under the weight of CIA operatives and specially created CIA bases for spying on Russia. But at least in formal terms, the US was initially very hesitant about training Ukrainian forces, about inflaming the situation in Donbass any further, at least kind of overtly and formally. Not so the British. And Chris Donnelly in July 2014, speaking to a British Parliamentary Defence Committee, he proposed, for example, sending a British standing force to the Baltics to dissuade Moscow. And I'm not sure how a few thousand British soldiers in Lithuania is going to in any way deter or frighten Russia, but this is what Donnelly believed would be the case. But not only that, he stated it was very important for Britain to take the leadership on this, as this will encourage the Americans to take a greater interest in NATO and reinforce their support of the organization. And we have an important role to play, us being Britain, in bringing the Americans in more. And so that's been the battle from 2014 to 2022, was trying to get the US to focus on Europe, not Asia, or other parts of the world where the US has significant interests and ambitions. It was to focus on Europe, and Ukraine was the issue. And it very rapidly became a dominant issue within US politics. And it very much was, during Trump's first term, and then Biden's god awful single term. Although, I mean, who knows at this rate, he might be running for re-election if there is another election in the US at some point in the future. We don't know. I can imagine this, Biden is kind of Davros, in this specially created mechanical wheelchair. Anyway, the point is that Britain exploits US domination and US power for its own political, intelligence, military, diplomatic, economic purposes. It doesn't always get what it wants, although it does get something out of doing this. And ever since the proxy war erupted, Chris Donnelly has been furiously emailing his assorted contacts saying, we have to get the US more involved. We have to counter US hesitation to escalate this. As we've discussed again, pass him, do check out our past broadcasts. I think that they do stand the test of time. That all manner of high-profile, elaborate, and catastrophically failed Ukrainian military operations, like the Krinky landings, which were an insane effort to recreate D-Day. That was cooked up by the British. The disastrous 2023 counteroffensive, which resulted in 100,000 Ukrainian casualties, dead, God knows how many people crippled for life, for literally nothing. That was encouraged by the British. And then you have the Kursk counter invasion, which was a British plan through and through, with the objective of which was to bring the US further into the war and normalize overt foreign involvement in the proxy war, bring it out into the open rather than just doing it secretly. Although I'm sure the Russians were well aware of the extent of Britain's involvement for a very long time. But anyway, There is a kind of silver lining here, though, which is the NATO summit in Ankara. It ended, and we discussed how it was a bit of a wet fart, to say the least. It ended with all sorts of commitments from European powers to spend ever more money on defence, and to give Ukraine tens of billions of dollars in military aid, which translates into US weapons. And Trump's also now speaking very positively about Zelensky. He's boasting about a joint US Ukrainian drone manufacturing factory being made somewhere in the States, and assisting Ukraine in creating their own Patriot missiles, because they have virtually none left as winter approaches, which is going to be, a very brutal time for whoever remains in Ukraine. I'm sure the numbers are dwindling to absolutely extraordinary levels of which we're not aware at this stage for a variety of reasons. But so that aspect of it is, again, quite intimidating, and it does seem that the US has finally, turned a corner, because it's getting a return on its investment in NATO now, which Donnelly in these leaks specifically states is, the way to keep the US engaged in NATO. But again, it's like, okay, so it's a bonanza for US weapons manufacturers, as long as they actually have the weapons to provide. And as we're seeing in Iran, with the ongoing intermittent attempts to wage war in Iran, which keep failing because the Iranians have escalation dominance, and there is very little the US or Israel can do to try and even attempt to tip the scales in their favor at this stage. That yeah, the weapons are not there, the munitions are not there, the capabilities to make those munitions are not there. So again, this might be a lot of hype and bluster, which will result in potentially nothing. Although, yes, the thing that we do have to still worry about, as always, is the fact that they will that there are people within Western governments, particularly in Britain, who are willing to wish into existence a major war that they cannot fight, on the basis that they think the US will, eventually, one way or another, come to the rescue. But the US can't come to the rescue, and this is exactly how Israel has gotten into so much trouble in its, never-ending attempts to create Greater Israel. They think that US financial and military support is illimitable, that it's just it's a bottomless pit. Well, I mean, on the money side, perhaps, because the US can print it. On the military side, not so much. And already, Israel has halted operate or significantly downgraded operations to attempt to outright annex the West Bank. They're in lots of trouble in Lebanon still, and they are formally, publicly saying they're going to sit out the war on Iran, because they literally cannot fight it at this stage. So a confusing and mixed picture, with plenty to worry about, but also plenty to mock and record as yet another chapter in the West's ongoing decline and fall, I think, Alex.
Indeed, indeed. Now, somebody pointed out in the comments that about the attempts to force Ireland into open NATO membership, and I just wanted to make a quick comment about that, which is that open NATO membership would be a formalization of what's been there for decades already, which is that the US has already used Shannon Airport repeatedly over the last 20 years to aid its occupation of both Afghanistan and Iraq. And the biggest reason why the Irish government, no matter which party leads it, whether it's Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, who are basically the same, or whether it was Sinn Féin, it's not just a matter of US military dominance. It's a matter of the fact that Ireland is tied into the European Union. Ireland also economically depends upon British trade, US capital, and also Franco-German capital for its, shall we say, rather flimsy, heavily financialized economy. And so, it depends upon these imperialist powers for its economic order, so to speak. And so they exercise a lot of power and leverage over the Republic of Ireland, which, by the way, is something that Irish revolutionary hero James Connolly understood very well, which is that you could remove the British from Dublin, although there is an argument to say that the Irish haven't actually done that, given the role that the British security services play in Irish law enforcement. But you can remove them from Dublin Castle, you can declare independence, you can have your own flag. But unless you're cut off from them economically, if you're still dependent upon trade with Britain, if you're still dependent upon capital being invested from the United States, from France, from Germany, well, then you don't really have an independent country. You have a flag and you have a passport, not to underestimate that, but you are heavily exposed to potential punitive measures to be taken by London, by Washington, by Paris, or by Berlin, or by all four. Which is why the slow progress of Ireland into NATO. And by the way, if you want to read some truly hysterical Paul Mason type commentary, try reading the pro-NATO ravings of writers in the Irish Times and elsewhere, which read like Paul Mason with an Irish accent, talking about the threat Russia poses to Ireland. It's like, what fucking world do these people live in? And the answer is the world that's dependent upon paychecks from NATO think tanks would be my best guess. So yes, there are people madder than Paul Mason, and they write for Irish newspapers, as it turns out. Kit, did you want to say anything just on the Ireland question?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, funnily enough, I was actually speaking to an Irish friend of mine yesterday about exactly this. And it is something that increasingly, average people throughout the Emerald Isle are noticing, that there is this deranged push by a lot of people from Cork, which is precisely where Morgan McSweeney hails from. There is a growing push to get Ireland into NATO, and which is, I mean, it's truly bizarre because, I mean, as you mentioned, on the one hand, I mean, what threat is Ireland under at all? I mean, apart from, funnily enough, the British, but also it's a completely insane push as well, because, I mean, from the perspective of Britain or America, particularly Britain, who are pushing Ireland to join NATO. What would they get out of it, really? Like, what would be fundamentally different? And I mean, on the subject of Ireland being part of the EU, what a lot of people forget slash don't know, because I mean, this happened at a time when the EU was not being looked at very seriously or critically by anyone apart from, very sadly, scum like Nigel Farage, is that the Lisbon Treaty, which I think that was that 2007. Was it? Yeah. Anyway, under the Lisbon
I think
Treaty,
it was about 2008 to 9. It was negotiated. Came in 2010, I think.
Okay, right, yeah. So the Lisbon Treaty, like it specifically has defence clauses which state that if which mirror NATO's notorious Article 5, that if an EU member state faces armed aggression, quote unquote, then other EU members must provide aid and assistance. That it compels them to do so. I mean, we've not seen that put into play in any formal way since then. But it is part of the EU constitution, and it's something that all members are effectively obligated to do. But also, the Lisbon Treaty stipulates that NATO is effectively the defence arm of the European Union. So, I mean, even if Ireland is not formally a member, then it doesn't actually really mean anything in the scheme of things. And indeed, if Ireland was to join, which the overwhelming majority of Irish people, including those in occupied British occupied Ireland, they don't want to join anyway. So it would be completely pointless, apart from the perspective of, oh well, there's another country that's part of our Europe-wide dragnet, just for the sake of just for the sake of it. This is a very different situation to, say, Finland or Sweden, which are historically neutral, did in many ways stick very rigidly to that neutrality policy, and now U.S. military bases are being constructed on their territory. They're going to start housing U.S. Missiles. And there's all sorts of changes being undertaken, like roads are being widened to allow tanks to drive down them and stuff. That's not going to happen in Ireland. However, as far as there being a rationale behind this deranged push to get Ireland into NATO, it might solve the occupied Ireland question, quote unquote, from Britain's perspective in a very favourable way. I believe that we've discussed on past episodes how the very strange. The very strange nature of the supposed race riots that engulfed Belfast a few months back, which had the Guardian suggesting that Britain was on the verge of civil war. We see how that turned out. But I think, and I believe that we both speculated at the time, that those race riots, which were completely synthetic, completely whipped up by loyalist paramilitaries, with violence restricted to Protestant areas, and it's certainly not all Protestants who were involved in this. It was a psychological warfare operation. It was a total setup. And an interesting media narrative to emerge was, oh, well, Catholics and Protestants were united like never before. Not true at all. But it came at a very useful time from the British state's perspective, when discussions about Irish unification were kind of gaining in currency. Now, Britain will never allow this, and their ongoing occupation of Ireland is increasingly untenable from every single perspective. Well, getting Ireland into NATO does mitigate that question to an extent, doesn't it?
Indeed, and just to make another point, the British Air Force has had control effectively over Irish skies since the 1950s. There was a treaty in the 1950s that gave Britain the right to fly constantly over Irish airspace. So the Irish government's been surrendering the independence that thousands of Irishmen fought and died for many decades, and it's been surrendering it to Britain. Now, the just on the role of the loyalist paramilitaries, who, by the way, there are loyalist organisations where I am in Scotland who are maintained by shady means for, I would argue, relatively similar purposes as those who are maintained in the occupied 6 counties of Ireland. They are a organised source of potential violence that the British state can unleash at any time that they should choose. Now, should, say, in 2014, Scotland have voted for independence, I would bet very heavily that those loyalist gangs would have been unleashed to create chaos. And that would have, the British state would have said, look, they can't even govern themselves. We can't possibly leave. Same play in Ireland now, which is that it is estimated that even by the BBC, and we've discussed this before, but it's worth re-emphasizing, the BBC, in an article from a few years ago, estimated that the loyalist paramilitaries had not actually lost any of their armed capacity since the Good Friday Agreement. They're sitting on like a stockpile of like small arms and God knows what now, given these people's access to the black market that's come out of the Ukraine war. Fuck alone knows what they've accumulated since then. And this is funded, and again, don't need to go too far for this information. It's funded by drug rackets, which the loyalist paramilitary terror gangs were always into drugs. They fall out with each other and shoot each other every now and again over the control of the drug rackets. The Irish media reported that like teenagers who were in debt to drug gangs were being offered clearance of their debts to be mobilized into these riots. What this was the British showing off basically that they've got this reserve force of reaction, so to speak, this paramilitary type organization sitting in the north of Ireland, which is what truly their occupation is based on. It's not based really on the British Army anymore. They're just there as a sort of token force. It's based on the fact that they've got this dangerous collection of reactionary criminals who they can mobilize, who are armed. And just to reflect on something that former leader of Sinn Féin, Gerry Adams, said in an interview he gave recently, he said, and I think he's telling the truth on this, that the IRA did everything it committed to under the Good Friday Agreement, that the IRA basically is no more. It disarmed and dissolved itself. Now, I think that's largely correct. It did. But he made another point in that interview, which is that the loyalists never disarmed and never demobilized. They're still there. So, and it's worth, I'll throw back to you if you want to comment any more on this, Kit, then isn't it more correct to say that the Good Friday Agreement ultimately rendered first of all, the IRA's armed struggle was rendered utterly meaningless by the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, because it essentially institutionalized British control over the North for another generation, and it didn't even disarm the loyalist paramilitaries who were meant to be the other side of that equation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've been talking about doing a special on occupied island with a focus on the Good Friday Agreement, because I think, yeah, it's important to bear in mind the kind of state, quote unquote, that's been created since the Good Friday Agreement, which is touted to this day as this major British diplomatic achievement, and blah, 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 blah. That occupied island is a failed state in every conceivable regard. The basic function, the basic functions of the state, don't work. It's yes, loyalist paramilitaries in charge. They rule via intimidation, by getting the population, particularly young people, as you mentioned, out of it on drugs and heavily indebted to them, so then they can be mobilized to stir up unrest, when required. It's a situation that is completely intractable unless the entire rotten structure is dissolved, which the British do not want at all costs, and they are willing to go to extraordinary lengths to prevent that from happening. I've reported on the leaked emails of a veteran MI6 officer called Pablo Miller, who was involved with Skripal and all sorts of other shady business in the Eastern Bloc around the time the time of the Soviet Union's dissolution. But I mean, he writes in several leaked communications about his experiences of being in Northern Ireland. It's very clear that he has this visceral hatred and contempt for Irish Catholics, himself being a Catholic, interestingly. But anyway, the point is that he frequently talks about how it was part of his duty, both within the British Army and within MI6, to ensure that Northern Ireland remained British, and how upset he would be if this changed in the modern day. So it cannot be allowed from Britain's perspective to dissolve, to result in reunification. Now, on the Good Friday point, and this is certainly something worth exploring more, as I say, it's touted as this major diplomatic, political success from Britain's perspective. It's a total disaster, and yet a lot of the people involved boast of their involvement in it today, and are in positions of significant influence, and are attempting to apply the Good Friday model to other sectarian conflicts, or countries or states that are riven by division of some kind. To give you an example, Jonathan Powell, who was Starmer's, I'm not sure if he's still there, maybe that's something to look into. Jonathan Powell was Tony Blair's chief of staff, very well connected individual. He oversaw the Good Friday Agreement, and subsequent to this, set up a firm that works with MI6. It's called Intermediate. It now has an office in Syria's presidential palace, and was involved in bringing HTS, i.e. al-Nusra, i.e. al-Qaeda, to power in Syria in late 2024. And Intermediate's website explicitly states that we apply the lessons of Good Friday to the world, etc. So in so many places, and this includes Lebanon, and this includes places in Africa, Asia, all over the world, you will find former British intelligence officers, or former British diplomats, or former British government employees who are explicitly trying to apply the Good Friday model to locally, and claiming that A, they're an expert in doing this, and B, that it was a grand success, when it's a total disaster. And that is the vision for, I mean, to use Lebanon as an example, as we've discussed, that is the vision for a Hezbollah-less Lebanon that's being advocated by the US and Israel and Britain. Once you strip away the rhetoric, is it will have an internal security force which is purely for purposes of repression and pacification of people who step out of line. The government, irrespective of who's in government, it doesn't actually really matter, because it's the military and intelligence elements that are actually running the show. And powerful individuals and organizations can basically commit crimes with impunity, because there's very little, if nothing, that the local population can do to hold them accountable. And that's what Britain is trying to replicate the world over.
Well, indeed, and why wouldn't they? Considering what it did was it gave them another 30 years in terms of institutionalizing their occupation of the northern six counties of Ireland. And I would also say that the military clique, which includes people like Miller, who you mentioned, absolutely will not accept any change to the status quo of the occupied six counties of Ireland. To them, mean that's like the final retreat of the empire. They get very upset at the idea of losing that. And David Cameron himself, in a meeting with the families of the victims of the Bloody Sunday massacre, observed that he would apologise for it, but there were people within the structure who would not accept that. And for once, I think David Cameron was actually telling the truth about that. There are people within that structure who would remove any prime minister who'd made too many concessions to the nationalist population, or who didn't honour the brave British death squads for carrying out their duties. So yes, we must return to the subject of occupied Ireland in the near future. Very interesting discussion to be had there. But talking of the fading and flailing and desperate attempts of the British militarists to prop themselves up, we go to what is very much the Viagra of the British establishment. That is the nuclear Viagra of the British nuclear weapons program, and it should be regarded as unsurprising that one of the first things that Andy Burnham has done, together with recommitting himself to the Ukraine war, is recommitted himself to the renewal of the nuclear weapons program, which will be, they say, building the so-called Dreadnought class submarines, which will schedule to enter service from the early 2030s. And it will be, of course, equipped with the new Trident will be renewed, equipped with a new warhead program named the Astrea, which will receive at least £15 billion in funding. And the total cost for replacing the current generation of submarines and the current generation of nuclear weapons will come to over 205 billion at the very least. Now, this, of course, is a long-standing farce played out in the British political and military establishment. The talk of continuous at-sea defence and Britain's independent nuclear deterrent, when, of course, it is no such thing. It does. An independent British nuclear weapons program hasn't existed since the 1950s. In reality, the US just took over the provision of nuclear weapons to Britain, and the British, rather than having their own capability, just agreed to use US missiles, the components of which are all made in the US, the software for which is made in the US and controlled from the US. And it is argued by some that the missiles can't even be fired without the US's say so. It's a farce. It's a farce that's designed to make the British still look militarily relevant, because it enables them to have what every single prime minister has called credibility, which means essentially that it makes the British look as if they've still got the power to be militarily significant, when in reality, as we've been discussing in the earlier part of the program, they just don't. And so it's there to give credibility to every British slime bag and scam artist from the City of London who's trying to do deals overseas, that ultimately this is backed up by the phenomenal military power of the British, when in reality it's a money-making scam. It's a way to absorb money into BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce. It's a way to transfer money to the US military industrial complex. And it's something that the British Prime Minister can't even fire himself. It's why, by the way, that they started fulminating at Corbyn, because of the risk that ultimately he cowarded out of this, the risk that he might cancel the programme. And and the fear was that if he cancelled the program, then suddenly everyone would look at Britain and it would be revealed that this is an empire with no clothes on anymore. So it's a fraud, it's a scam, it's a giant waste of money and resources there ultimately to make the British look as if they're capable of doing something which they're not anymore. Kit, 205 billion, a hell of a thing for the naked emperor to make it look as if he's anything other than flaccid.
Indeed, and as we know, the Trident nuclear submarines get fixed with super glue. I would be more than happy to do that job for half the money. Do get in touch if you're interested, Ministry of Defence. One thing that actually jumped to mind as you were discussing this, Alex, and very much agreed with everything you just said. When recently Radoslav Sikorski, who's the Poland's deputy prime minister, a former anti-communist terrorist, who's married to the god-awful Anne Applebaum. In advance of Burnham becoming prime minister, he was doing the rounds of British media, and I believe he appeared on Channel 4, gave a quite a bullying interview where he said that Britain is wasting money on welfare when it should be spending on warfare and blah blah. And none other than Aaron Bastani, the voice of the radical left, piped up to condemn Sikorski's lack of gratitude, particularly given that Poland enjoys being part of Britain's nuclear umbrella. And this is specifically something that Bastani called attention to. So this belief that Trident is somehow in any way significant, it cuts very deep, including with people who claim to be very progressive and radical, at least in the mainstream. So that's something to bear in mind. Trident is a sick joke, and not just because it gets fixed. The submarines get fixed with super glue. It is completely dependent on the US. The fleet is decaying. The US has neither the interest nor I don't even think they have the necessary means to repair and refurbish these ailing submarines. It's basically Trident is basically unusable, and it must also be stressed as well that the mere fact that Britain has Trident, it's one of many examples of Britain's post World War II decline and inability to get to grips with the fact that it's an irrelevant island off the coast of Western Europe. And so, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, you do have this nuclear race, not only to harness the supposed benefits of nuclear power, but also to gain nuclear weapons. It was this kind of test of national greatness, and it was felt that Britain would not be in the top class of powers in the world if it didn't have nuclear weapons. It still doesn't. It rents some unusable nukes from the US, but even challenging this, because it's such a core component of Britain's enduring imperial delusions and mythos, at least for people in power, it is, whether that's political or intelligence or military or otherwise. But it's also it's on a par with the as we've discussed, the complete embarrassment of Britain's aircraft carriers. You built at enormous expense with absolutely extraordinary levels of hype about how this was going to be a game changer, and Britain was now going to effectively police the oceans and enforce the international rules-based order. And then this, of course, resulted in the end product is aircraft carriers that have spent more time at base being repaired than at sea, and also don't have any fighter jets to actually carry around with them. So they just go around the world pointlessly with no fighter jets on them whatsoever. And indeed, most of the deployable navy alongside them to ensure that they're vaguely safe. Although they're sitting ducks for drone attacks from Ansarallah or Iran or even perhaps Hezbollah at this stage. So yeah, it's one of those things in I guess mainstream British politics. It cannot be questioned, and indeed, if anyone was any politician or political party was to seriously criticize or question whether Britain should still be wasting enormous sums of money on these completely unusable weapon and irrelevant weapon systems, well, they would be under significant attack, including from people who claim to be the opposition, as it were. So, I mean, yeah, and another intractable component of the modern British state, up there with occupied Ireland, or perhaps even Britain's bases in Cyprus. Irrelevant, probably more trouble than it's worth, pointlessly expensive, no obvious benefits, but it needs to be maintained because reasons. Which should worry us, and I do think that it kind of brings us full circle. The fact that Burnham's making so much noise about this massive new investment in Britain's nuclear capabilities, when what he's announcing isn't actually new at all and is not actually going to do anything substantive or meaningful. I think that's quite a fitting microcosm for Burnham's premiership and just for Britain in the modern day, really.
Well, indeed, yes. And this is like if nothing else, we like to think that we at the Decline and Fall Show have taken you on a tour down the highways and byways of British decline. And the decline and fall of Britain will, of course, only be completed when we go full circle and all of the nations that were captured by England and welded into the mess that is called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland are freed from the domination of the City of London and can be independent nations once again. And that includes England being freed from the domination of the City of London. And one day, the foul excrescence known as the City of London will be all pulled down, and it will be turned into a green space where dogs can go and take a shit. And I think that will be a fitting tribute to the creatures that have worked there. Now, there is one more item that I think we should comment on before we bring this live show to a close for today. We have been specifically asked about the events in Ceuta, the Spanish enclave in northern Morocco, a sort of lingering relic of the old Spanish Empire, where, depending upon the numbers you believe, around 50,000 people tried to storm into it just yesterday, at least 20 of whom died in the attempt. Now, there's been a number of interpretations of this, including, of course, with significantly from various Israeli trolls, all safely based in the United States, including the wretched Yair Netanyahu, who is now going by the name of Jonathan Hunn, because he doesn't want to be associated with his dad's surname anymore, claiming that this is, or suggesting that this is the work of the Zionists in collaboration with the wretched pro-US King of Morocco, essentially channeling migrant flows into Ceuta to try and force the Spanish out as punishment for the very weak protests that the Spanish government under that absolute fraudster Pedro Sanchez has uttered about the Israeli conduct of the war on Gaza and Lebanon, and his very weak opposition to the war in Iran. Now, we recently covered a very interesting story with regard to Sanchez, and that is, of course, the case of US activist Fergie Chambers, who has been detained by the Spanish government at the request or demand of the Trump administration, who I believe is still in the maximum security prison and facing deportation to the United States. Now, to me, there's problems with the interpretation that this is all some Zionist plot, because if you remember back long enough, Ceuta and Melilla are gateways into Europe for the never-ending flow of dispossessed and poverty-stricken people, not just from Morocco, but from the rest of North Africa, from the still chaotic and afflicted by US, French, and British designed wars in Western Africa, in places like Mali, Chad, etc., Mauritania as well. And so these are gateways into the European Union for people who want to, well, do any kind of work possible. And so there's been repeated incidents where large numbers of potential migrants have tried to force their way in to get over into Europe. So this isn't a new thing. Now, is it possible that the Moroccan government, in collaboration with the US, has been um, pushing more migrant waves towards these enclaves, or so I should in Spanish enclaves in Morocco? It's certainly possible, but we shouldn't get into the business as some have. What I would call multipolar slop channels have done, which is claiming that we must defend Spanish possession of parts of Morocco because the Moroccan king's a US collaborator, and Sanchez is apparently the savior because he said some nice words. Well, the Chambers case reveals just what Sanchez's nice words are really worth. Spain's still part of NATO and part of the EU. They're not leaving either anytime soon. All of this is just verbals and arguments between fundamentally people who are still partners in the same imperialist system. So be very wary of some of the interpretations that are floating around out there. Kit, did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, I absolutely agree that it would be wrong-headed to view Spain as completely innocent. Although I mean in this let alone Sanchez himself. I mean, by the same token, I do think that this has been it's a long-standing threat that's been made over many years that Israel will recognize Ceuta as Moroccan territory, and that the Spanish should get the hell out of there. And in a bitter irony, they are emulating German imperialism. Do check out our German imperialism special, which was all about colonization and imperialism under the banner of liberation. Exploiting issues like this to extend their own power. Now, I mean, Morocco itself as well is it's a country I actually travelled around quite extensively. The extent to which it is a US lackey is actually rather underrated. There is a huge degree of American penetration, not just economic, but political, military, security, intelligence, etc. Morocco was involved in the CIA's global torture program. We're coming up, of course, to the anniversary of that, the 25th anniversary of 9/11, and that kicking off globally. And it was complicit in the enhanced interrogation of supposed terrorists who were innocent people in pretty much every case. And Morocco has been designated a major non-NATO US ally. In fact, Morocco was the very first state in the world to recognize US independence in 1777. So they have very, very long-standing and strong ties, to the extent that there is a high degree of command and control over what Morocco does, exerted by Washington. So I think it's almost certainly the case that a factor here is the US government leaning on Morocco to create problems for Spain, due to Spain refusing to allow its territory to be used for striking Iran, and some of its rhetoric on Palestine. Because yes, you can't have people step out of line at all on these issues, no matter how flaccid and ultimately meaningless that might be in practice. Even rhetoric is something that the US is deeply concerned about. And in the wake of the UN vote on the Gulf War, because Yemen was the one country along with Cuba that voted against it, the US severely punished them for that, even though it was basically pointless. It didn't discredit or hinder US efforts to wage that war at all. So I'm sure that is certainly part of it. But I mean, within that, there is also this stage management of all of these right-wing figures who are jumping on this as an excuse to demonize migrants, to demonize Spain for failing to deal with the issue of migrants. Elon Musk is, of course, all over this. And interestingly, Italian officials are already racing to state that Spain should be removed from Schengen because of its inability to control irregular and uncontrolled immigration, posing a threat to the national security of the entire EU. And of course, the Italian government pretty much openly venerates fascist era figures, etc. So, a lot of different objectives are being served here by this episode or incident, however you want to frame it. I do think even the ultimate objective could just be distraction, just creating chaos for the sake of it. And this serves as a tremendous distraction from as we've been discussing, the completely cataclysmic failure of the renewed war in Iran, which seems to have lasted a few days. Suddenly there's this new flashpoint and new issue, which various different political actors, ranging from the US to France and Britain and Israel and others, can exploit for their own purposes. But I would be extremely extremely wary of people framing Spain as somehow this valiant anti-imperialist crusader, because it's just not the case. And I might add that in an update on Fergie's case, this is ongoing. He remains in prison. His access to the outside world and ability to talk to his family is extremely limited. He's going to be there for quite a while. There's all sorts of there's going to be a lot of toing and throwing almost inevitably. If he wins his bid to block his extradition, well, the US can appeal. This could be going on for a very, very, very long time, a la Julian Assange. And I do think that we should be continuing to make as much noise as we possibly can for Fergie in the intervening time.
Indeed, and I will just echo something that somebody has said in the comments, which is freedom for Western Sahara. Indeed, certainly that's something which should happen, and something which would upset all the right people if it did happen. Now, and my thanks to the well over 700 of you who are watching live at the moment. This is a testament to the fact that we have a rather dedicated fan base out there. So thanks for all of you for tuning in. Now, we will be having upcoming specials on the Spy Cops inquiry. That's coming next week, which is an inquiry into the activities of the Special Demonstration Squad in Britain, which is essentially a undercover operation to systematically infiltrate the entire left and the trade unions, run out of the Met Police and the Association of Chief Police Officers. So interesting coverage of that coming up. Now, Kit, you indicated a moment ago that, of course, we're coming up to the anniversary of 9/11. I think just to sort of hit this on the fly, so to speak, it'd be worth us doing a legacy of the War on Terror special, because the legacies very much are all around us. If you look at the rhetoric of like British fascists now, it's different to even what it was in the days of the BNP. Now it's all like pure like War on Terror era stuff about the Muslims, the Muslims, the Muslims, all of which came out of the so-called mainstream, all of which is taken directly from like War on Terror inspired messaging about Muslims as the enemy within. Of course, like people like Stephen Yaxley Lennon, well-known enthusiast for Zionism, take this a little bit further. But all of this has its origins in the War on Terror period. Much of the chaos we're looking at across the world right now is a direct result of that period. So I think it more than justifies a special on the 9/11 legacy, don't you think?
Absolutely. Let's do it. Let's do it. And if there's anything that our viewers and listeners would specifically like us to tackle, do email us, comment. We are receptive to that, and it also helps us with the algorithm. So winning all round.
Indeed, indeed. Now, this has been a Decline and Fall production. As you can see, there will be clips from this live show that will be released on the Decline and Fall channel over the next week or so. Do tune in for some of the upcoming specials. We have more to say coming on the Iran war. We're probably going to look at the Yemen war and the British role in that as well. More to come on Occupied Island and much, much more. So if you haven't subscribed, do so on the Substack site. You can find all kinds of interesting things on there. I thank you all for tuning in. I am in an undisclosed, potentially underground location now in the soon-to-be independent Scotland, hopefully so. So thank you all for tuning in, and I will leave the final word to our man in the once and future socialist Yugoslavia, live from his Hoja bunker.
No, well, not much to add apart from it can get lonely here in the Hoja bunker sometimes. So, do like, share, subscribe. We really appreciate it, guys. We are up against it. The algorithmic gods are not on our side, but you are, and we're extremely grateful for that. So, see you very soon, and we hope you enjoyed it today. God bless you. Take care. Keep up the fight.